All right, Simon,
Thank
take it
you. And I
away.
think if we have the option for live captioning, we want to turn that on as well. Um,
No, I haven't been able to get it. I've been trying. Let me see.
if it
Mm,
was possible for someone to request it, I feel like that worked one week.
I did get it 1 week. Um,
I can
Shoshana,
see them.
what's your cat's name?
This one is June. He's the big orange one, and the gray one is Johnny.
John and June?
June and Johnny.
Johnny.
Yep.
Johnny, yeah.
Okay, I've got captions going now.
Okay, great. So we will get started and everyone can see my screen.
yep.
Yep,
All right,
I can see
great.
you this year.
Amazing. So if everyone wants to just mute, and obviously, as you know, unmute when you have a question, and we can get started. So um, we're focusing finally on the modern period. But if you haven't noticed, I seem to also be stuck in the past and with history. And so we're starting with modernity, but not necessarily contemporary Judaism just yet, although we will get there. And so, hello and welcome to you all. I found this image and it was going to go in another slide that I can point out where it belongs, but I liked it so much that I decided to put it in the title. And it's actually a female Tanait who was a leader of a yeshiva in like 300 years ago. So we'll come back to her, but welcome everybody. Um, so I actually wanted to start with the story of Glickle and her literature that she has left behind. So Glickle is this 17th century really fascinating woman. And I know, again, as I said, modernity. We're starting to come to the beginning of the modern period. And Glickle is really fascinating because she leaves behind the first of its kind, some kind of memoir, although it's not categorized by her in that way, but it's an autobiographical telling of her life's events, interspersed with kind of advice, with religious and philosophical interludes. And it's written in Yiddish over the span of about 30 years between 1691 and 1719. And so I mentioned in the slides here, autobiographies are tied to this Enlightenment focus on the individual self. And we can kind of see the roots of this starting in Glickle's telling of her own narrative, of her own life. But as I mentioned as well, she never gives her book a title or a genre designation. So the idea of memoir, of autobiography, that is a later designation that we assign to the text. And there's kind of a push and pull throughout. It's a long volume, it's in 7 little books or parts. And there's this constant sort of push and pull between tradition and modernity. So she's very focused on her responsibilities in the home, her children, her husband, although she's a widow, um, but her husband's. But she's also, as a widow, responsible for the finances of her household, for business. She's aware of political things that are going on in her time. And so there is this kind of push and pull that is really fascinating for a woman in that time, not only to be experiencing all these things, as I'm sure many women were, but for us to actually have this written record of her story. So I just have a couple quotes from the very beginning, and you can see it's directed towards her children, and it is in fact one of her sons who first publishes this text after she dies. But she says, I began writing this with God's help after the death of your pious father, since it afforded me some pleasure when the melancholy thoughts were upon me. I passed many sleepless nights in the throes of severe anxiety, for we were like sheep without a shepherd. And here we have these biblical allusions that are just woven in. As our faithful shepherd was no more, and I feared I would give way to melancholy thoughts, God forbid. So I would often rise, typo, in the night to spend the sleepless nights in this fashion. And she also makes clear, I do not intend to compose a book of moral instruction for you. Our sages have composed several such works, and we also possess our holy Torah, where one can find everything and learn what is good for us. We may cling firmly to our beloved Torah. So what I wanted to highlight here is a couple of things. One being her familiarity, of course, with Torah and with Jewish learning. It seems likely that a lot of the quotes and the allusions that she's drawing may have come more so from oral tradition than from necessarily reading the Hebrew texts all of the time. But clearly there is this knowledge that women of her stature, she was a well-to-do society lady in Western Europe. And she, but she is clearly familiar with, responsible for the education of her children, and very much informed by this Jewish religious perspective, which guides even her own retelling of her history. And so I thought that it was an interesting place to start, just as a kind of bridge between, some of the texts from antiquity we've been looking at, and these ideas from earlier on in Jewish history. Glickle serves as a kind of bridge for us between the past and what is to come in the Enlightenment, and sort of the voices of women becoming more central and more accessible to us as well. And I have a couple of really short video clips that I'm going to share that this professor here is the translator of the actual memoir, and she did a newer translation a number of years ago, and so she's going to be speaking in Yiddish, but it's also subtitled, and there's just a couple of minutes, and I thought her perspective was really valuable and hopefully insightful for us all. So I'm just going to start that. There's two 2-minute videos.
Glickl ist eine jüdische Frau, was hat geschrieben ein Buch im 17. Jahrhundert. Und alles, was wir wissen wegen ihr, ist geschrieben in dem Buch. Oder kurz ein paar Protein, wenn sie ist gestorben oder kleine Sachen. Das ist sehr eine außergewöhnliche Sache, weil wir haben nicht in der ganzen aschkenasischen Kultur von Onib bis ihr haben wir nicht keine Autobiografie. Das haben wir können haben Pizzalach Autobiografie, 5 Seiten, aber da ist ein Buch, 330 Seiten in dem Manuskript. Eine Frau hat sich weggesetzt und geschrieben, nicht Autobiografie, Sichroines, nur Sichroines. Und das Buch ist nicht in ihrer Handschrift. Wir haben 2 Kopies, was eine von ihren Kindern hat gemacht. Und die 2 Kopies, die 2 Abschreibungen seien gekommen, der gangen zu einem Professor, ein jüdischer Gelernter, und hat herausgegeben den Text. Der Pfarrer wissen wir wegen ihm. Hat übergesetzt in verschiedene Sprachen. Da von dem Buch, der wissen wir sicher, dass die Frau ist geboren geworden im mitten 17. Jahrhundert, darum 1645 in Hamburg. Sie ist nicht kein Tagebuch von einem Mädel, ja, was hebt an und geht mit dem Tagebuch. Der Tagebuch begleitet ihr Leben. Nur das ist eine Frau, die beschlossen zu schreiben, ihre Sichroines noch ein Tod von ihrem Mann. Und sie ist sehr interessant zu sehen, warum sie sagt, die nicht einzufallen in melancholische Gedanken. Okay. Also ich habe nicht gekannt schlafen, lege ich aufstehen bei Nacht und geschrieben das. Sie weiß nicht, was sie schreibt. Sie hat nicht keinen Namen, nicht Sichroines, nicht Autobiografie, nicht mein Leben. Das.
Let me just, sorry, that Let me see which one to- We just have another minute, and then if anyone has any questions or any comments or anything, but we'll just, this is, yeah, under 2 minutes.
Noch sehr wichtige Sache ist,
I have
sie
a
hat
question.
lieb zu illustrieren.
Yeah,
This woman who is talking, the Professor Chava,
Yeah.
whatever her name is, where is she from originally?
I believe that she is in Israel where these videos are being taken. She teaches at a university in Israel, but clearly she's speaking Yiddish, not Hebrew. And I don't know. I just know. So she's like the editor of the standard translation for the text.
She just happens to look like an aunt of mine who was much older than my father. So like that aunt was probably born in Latvia in like 1885 or something like that, 1890. And I just thought it was interesting that this woman looks like a member of my family.
I mean, it's always very hard to say that people aren't related within, especially Ashkenazic Jewry. But these videos are from a couple of years ago, so but that's an interesting observation. If you want to turn back on mute, we'll just watch the last minute of this.
Du kennst Menschen und ich euch, was für jede Sache haben sie am meisten. Wegen dem, ich will dir erzählen, also ist Glück. Auf dem hat sie am meisten und auf dem hat sie eine zweite meiste. Und auf dem hat sie euch was zu sagen. Und da passt sich das Sprichwort, okay? Siehst du, was sie hat gelernt. Und Leute schreiben, Leuten Stil, weißt du, sie das Buch hat sie gelernt, oder sie die meiste hat sie gehört, oder die meiste hat sie abgeschrieben von einem Buch. Du weißt, wo können wir haben so viel Material wegen dem Leben? Nirgends nicht. Das ist ein äußergewöhnliches Dokument, was ist euch schön geschrieben, sehr ästhetisch. Jetzt kannst du wissen, was eine Frau hat gelernt, wie eine Frau hat getracht wegen solchen Sachen. Versteht sich, dass nicht alle Frauen, es ist nicht kein Beispiel für alle Frauen, aber für die alle Frauen, was es sind da hunderte Frauen, was sie in ihr Buch, öfter nicht hunderte, aber auch 100 Frauen, ihre Kräuves, ihre Schochentes, andere Frauen, was sie kennen, bekannte Frauen, Goyes, als ist dort und da, ist es nicht zu abschätzen, ein Werk, ja.
All right. So, there we go. So yeah, I thought that was worth sharing. Any sort of thoughts aside from other familial similarities? Any questions or?
I just wanted to say this is really cool. I have never heard of Glickle, and I'm going to go try and find an English translation. So thank you.
Yeah, of course. There's an edition that's published that's and Chava Turniansky, that woman is the person who compiled it, and then it's been translated from the Yiddish, or I think it was from Hebrew. Anyway, there's a lot of translating. It's translated, but this is oh, I don't know. Yeah, this is the volume.
Thank you.
It's published by Brandeis University Press.
Great.
So I thought, yeah, just in terms of when we talk about gender and women's roles, like this is really exciting because it's one of the first cases that we actually have in Jewish history of a woman telling her own story. And, you know, we're not filling in suppositions, we're actually hearing directly from her. And there is also just a wealth of kind of references to Jewish culture, Jewish texts, and like clearly, you know, her Judaism is instrumental and really guiding a lot of elements of her life. And so you see sort of her religious experience, along with like her domestic and actually her professional life, just a very interesting woman. Ellis, you had a question?
Just a comment. This does seem like a kind of a modern thing to do in a way. You know, the idea of passing on your stories to the next generation. We've, in my family, have asked some of my older relatives to do a similar oral history, sit down with someone and talk about what their life was like, because you don't get that information on a typical conversation. You know, you're always talking about the weather or something unimportant, but the idea of capturing your thoughts and passing that on to the next generation is seems like a modern thing, you know, and it's something that we've tried to capture as well
Yeah.
in our family.
For sure. And I think I made a reference, I believe last week or so, to the film Yentl, like Barbara Streisand, and I was reading her memoir that came out last month. And honestly, there is a similar kind of storytelling component where she's telling one thing and then, you know, she has an opinion about something else. So she's going to share that opinion with you. And I think it's funny to sort of see, you know, this instinct really early on, you know, centuries ago, in a time where we typically don't have access to this kind of thing. And I just thought, you know, that was hopefully a useful way to kind of lead us into this conversation and center actual women's voices here. So I'll try and make this, there we go. I'm gonna try and make this full screen. There we go.
One other comment or question.
Yeah.
Is that I wonder how many women at that exact period when she wrote would have even been literate.
Yeah, she is definitely, you know, a specific kind of case with a certain amount of money and privilege. But as we're going to find in the next slide, women's literacy actually was not super uncommon. It's just more so that we find women are not as proficient in reading Hebrew, which is not a spoken language aside from prayer. But in terms of vernacular languages like Yiddish, actually many Jewish women at that time would have been at least somewhat literate. So,
okay, thank you.
Yeah, no, and it's definitely, I think, I don't have the statistics on it, but I think there is a higher rate of literacy in Jews in that era of Jewish women than non-Jewish women. And we see that they're here in the next slide that we're getting to. We're actually going to look at women's religious texts. So I wanted to turn our attention to Techinas. There's a million different ways of transliterating it. I tried to keep it somewhat uniform, but you know, if you are doing any Google searches later, all of the different spellings will find some results for you. But Techinas are basically women's prayers that were said and actually printed largely in Yiddish, and they would have been sort of supplementary to the liturgical readings at the synagogue that men did. And so the Hebrew root for the Techinas is lehitanen, to supplicate. And so there is this similar kind of move to develop prayers that women can do, even if their responsibilities and their experiences of prayer might be different than men. So we don't exactly know when the practice of Techinas started. We do have a sense that they originated in Germanic lands even as early as the Middle Ages. And the first known Techina to appear in print was from the 16th century. And what we find is that medieval Jewish women were often literate, as I said, but more familiar with the vernacular language than Hebrew. And so Techinas in contrast to the prayers you'd find in a Siddur that men would be reading, are much more intimate prayers that are typically composed in the mother tongue, the Mama Lushan. So in many cases in Europe at that time, it would have been Yiddish. And we have this reference in a collection of Techinas by Isaac Sulkash in the late 16th century, where he talks about how women should really be reciting Techinas in Yiddish so that they would better understand what they're saying. So clearly there is already a practice of Techinas and women practicing and participating in the recitation of Techinas, but there does seem to be an understanding that women are less likely to be knowledgeable in Hebrew and Torah study because, you know, those institutions and practices were not really afforded to them in the same capacity as with men. Nan, you had a question?
Yeah, were these prayers meant to be said personally privately by yourself, or was this said in a group of women, or was this said in the synagogue, or these prayers?
Yeah, so we're going to come to that a little bit actually in just a moment. So I think that I don't think there's one right answer to that, but it does seem to be a separate kind of context in some cases from men's prayers in synagogues, although not entirely. But just in terms of our factoids, the first known edition of Techinas was a bilingual Hebrew and English edition published at the turn of the 17th century in Prague. And we have printed editions of Yiddish Techinas becoming more widespread in the 17th century. And what really sort of helps facilitate this as well is we find higher literacy rates with the onset of the printing press and the fact that, you know, written prayers are actually just much more accessible to access. And so there's a lot of the women's Techinas are more pocket-sized or just printed in pamphlets, so they'll have a few specific prayers perhaps for a particular context so that people could take them. And I believe that some of these prayers, not all of them would have been exclusively for women. There also were some men's Techinas, but in general, the majority of these prayers were performed by women, and we have good reason to believe that many of them also were composed by women. So in some of the earlier texts that we have that are extant, there isn't always actually attribution to an authorial source. They're just kind of there. I know that there's one collection that just says like by a group of pious women, and then later on, as Techinas become more widespread and become more ubiquitous, you do actually see attributions of these prayers by particular women. So I thought it would be helpful to kind of do a bit of a comparison between the traditional prayers that we would find in a Siddur and the Techinas, which are mostly a form of sort of women's prayer. So as mentioned, most of the prayers that men would be performing in synagogue in a minyan are in Hebrew, whereas Techinas were most often vernacular in Yiddish so that everyone could understand them. The prayers you find in the Siddur are generally fixed and obligatory, so they're rooted in those time-based commandments we spoke about last week or so. And with Techinas, there is less of a sort of prescribed time and place for them. As I mentioned, there are tons of different Techinas that were composed for various life cycle events, times of the year, times of the day, but they are less bound in the way of traditional halacha because this goes beyond the strict halachic requirements for women's prayer. And so the other thing, and to answer, I think it was Nan's question, many of these prayers would have been performed in the home. and on a more individual level. And so the traditional texts that we have in the Siddur are intended more for group prayer, with the prayer formulae being in the plural. And interestingly enough, Techinas are usually phrased in the singular form, and there's often even a space for the particular petitioner to insert her own name. So like, I, blank woman from here, am asking God for these things. So it's a much more personal, intimate kind of prayer genre. And I think that, you know, the fact that they were written and performed in vernacular language meant that there was a lot more creativity and intentionality. It's not just a recitation of a formula that you are doing passively. It's kind of an act, even if you're reading it from a book or from a text, you know, you're reading it in your mother tongue most of the time. And so there is a much more intimate connection in some ways than the traditional prayer formulae that we might have. And interestingly enough, we see this in gender egalitarian Siddurim today, but there is actually a focus on the matriarchs along with the patriarchs in the Techina. So there is already this awareness of women's voices, of women's experiences, and this centering of women in Jewish ritual and Jewish prayer. And so, yeah, I'm not sure who raised their hand first, Karen or Nan, but I want to get to both of you.
Okay, I'll
Well,
start.
Oh.
Oh, go ahead, Karen. Go ahead, Karen.
Yeah, we'll hear from Karen.
So I just had a singular question, and that is this an indication that women went to the synagogue or the temple or the shul less frequently and prayed at home, whereas men were the center of synagogue prayer to begin with, even though we know that women and men were separated? Were there more, was it more usual for men to go and the women to stay home?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't have an absolute answer for any of that. My understanding, based on these prayer formulae, based on sort of the responsibilities that women would have had, is that the synagogue was more of a public space for men's prayer. However, I think that because many of these prayer spaces would have been segregated, I think it's safe to say that some women would have also attended services, but they would not have necessarily been counted in a traditional quorum of minyan. So it's
Were they praying individually when they were at the service?
I don't have an answer for that. I know that the Techinas are more domestic in nature. They are more focused on private prayer, but there is, depending on different communities, there may well have been communities where women were supplementing and supplicating with these Techinas as well. So yeah, thank you for that question. And also, Nan, you had your question as well?
Yeah, I have a couple of questions. One is the focus on patriarchs and matriarchs. Are the matriarchs all that they're mentioned? Are they all people that you would find in the Hebrew Bible, or are there additional names that are traditional names that are used?
So I believe that most of them are biblical figures, but they're not necessarily. I said matriarchs, but I also know that, like, I have this little Hebrew part of Chana Mitzvot, and there's this kind of acronym of these kinds of prayers that you get in the Techinas, that Achat, Nun, and Hey, and it had to do with the different kinds. So Achat, forget actually now, I was going to put it in the slide and I was like, I'll remember that. but the nun there was for cycles of nidah, of family purity. And so there's a whole host of techinas that would have been associated with the menstrual cycle, with birth, and family purity. The hay is hadlikat hanerot, so the lighting of the candles. And so there would have been specific prayers focused on candle lighting. And the chet, I am at this moment blanking on, but there are these kind of set times where prayers would have been taking place. But did you want to repeat part of the question? Because I may have gotten off track there.
I just wondered if there were names of matriarchs
Oh,
that were
yes.
not biblical.
Yes. So where I was going with the Hannah thing is that Hannah, I think we spoke a little bit about in terms of ancient Israel and the prophets. Hannah was the mother of Samuel, who prays, and she's kind of held up as the model and the exemplar of what individual prayer to God and supplication can look like. And so there are these references to figures like Hannah. They are mostly biblical figures, although they are not limited to just the wives of biblical patriarchs, as far as I know. It's kind of hard to access some of the techinas because I didn't have a critical edition with a number of them. So I was kind of relying on secondary sources. So I don't actually, this is something that I'm not super knowledgeable on, but I was just really fascinated as I was pulling together some information. So I don't have like a kind of compendium of who is and who isn't really mentioned or brought up. But and of course as well, I think the texts that we have are probably only a very small piece of the number of techinas that would have been circulating around, and also the amount that would have just been in oral tradition versus actually having been written down and published. So I think that based on just kind of the genre itself, there seems to be a lot more room for kind of individuality. And my thinking is that, you know, there would have been a wide variety of women that would have been held as exemplars and referenced in these prayers.
Okay, I had the second question I have, well, actually I have two more questions. One is that I'm not familiar with the historical aspect of prayers in Judaism. Did men have similar compendiums of private prayers, or did they just primarily rely on the liturgical prayers that we would see in a siddur?
So I think that these would have been sort of supplementary. I think I know that some of the techinas were not exclusively for women as well. So I think this was, on the one hand, you know, men would have been participating in this tradition. However, this is really more intended as an alternative means of prayer, because the women would not have necessarily been partaking in those standard liturgies. And so this is kind of a different model of an individualized prayer that seems pretty specific to women's religious experience.
Which brings me to my third question, which is that from what you were saying, that it seems to me children would have been exposed to these prayers in the home, especially the prayers for things like candle lighting and stuff. But maybe I'm just wondering if a lot of men would have grown up with having heard their mothers saying these prayers, so they would have been familiar with them.
Yeah, I would definitely think that just makes sense and would be the case. And, you know, on the one hand, it seems like the techinas are really primarily women's prayers, but men also are part of this tradition of this kind of individualized, non-strictly liturgical prayer. So I definitely think that men would have been exposed and familiar with this as well. But interestingly enough, so there's the image that I have on the left here is for a Rosh Chodesh, for the start of a month. And these are kind of standard cyclical events of the year that women, as you know, the people in charge of the household, and in terms of also like their menstrual cycles, these are times that are actually just as important for women as they are for men in the reading of Torah. So, you know, there seems to be a lot of focus on the needs, the religious needs of women, and these techinas in many ways serve as a response to those needs. So I have an example here that I was able to source, and this is obviously translated, so I'm sure it's far less beautiful than it would be in Yiddish. And I don't know if we want to necessarily read this all aloud, but we can take a quick look. Give me a pure, fresh heart that is not despondent, so that I may worship you with all my heart and without falsehood, not grudgingly or sadly, but gladly and joyfully, so that I may carry out your commandments with great happiness. There's also this emphasis uniting all good people, so our children show great respect to all pious people, those who fear you and love you greatly and keep your commandments and earn their keep through their own efforts. So some of this starts to resemble some of the Psalms and the as well as some of the wisdom literature that we looked at a couple of weeks ago. And the fearing and loving of God comes back to that Deuteronomic principle of that you shall fear God, you shall follow God, and these kind of core tenets of Jewish spiritual experience. But here we also have an example of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are named, along with Moses, Aaron, David, and Solomon. But then we also got Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, Leah, Hannah, Abigail, and other saintly men and women, and pious men and women. So this is actually from the 17th century that's been translated. So I see two hands that are up. Karen, were you first?
So I'm wondering about the word saintly.
Yeah, I think that's a bit of a translation misnomer. I'm not sure
Yeah.
what the original word is. That starts to sound a little bit Christian.
Yes, that's what I was wondering.
Yeah, I didn't have access to the original text here, so I can't verify that, but I did want to just provide a small example of what some of these texts would be
So
like.
that's good. It's very personal,
Yeah,
you know.
for sure. And Aaron, you also have a question?
Yeah, I do. So at the very bottom, there's a name. Is
Yeah.
that supposedly the author of this?
Yes, and it's published in that text, Meinekes Rivka.
Okay, because are we sure that most of these are written by women rather than men?
This one seems to clearly be identified with a woman. As I was sort of saying, some of the earlier techinas are not actually attributed with a name or linked to a particular name or group, but some of them that we do have seem pretty clearly, even if they weren't necessarily written in the form that we have them by that particular person, there is clearly a tradition associating them with those particular texts.
Do we
So,
think men were writing them also for women?
for women,
Yeah.
that's hard to say. I think that's speculative. And there are men's texts that also contain techinas, but they are far less ubiquitous than the women's ones.
Okay, because I'm struck by the fact that there isn't great wishes here for things that are outside the home.
There is or there isn't?
There is not. I mean, except for the religious things, like may the temple be rebuilt, but I don't see anybody wishing for great wealth or
No.
Yeah, I mean, this is a kind of more, this is intended for the morning, so there are specific times, and maybe when you wake up, the
Okay.
first thing you're thinking isn't, how am I going to get rich quick?
Okay.
Some days.
In fact, she says she does not want
Right.
great houses and beautiful clothes.
Exactly. Yeah, let us desire only that which we need.
Yeah, that's why I asked.
Thank you. So, oh, was there another question?
I was just going to point out that there was the line about that her children should learn to support themselves. So there is a little bit of the outside focus as well.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. So as I was also putting this together, I was searching for early rabbinic women and figures who would have been, you know, either, if not rabbis, kind of proto-rabbinic figures. I found some really interesting stuff on this woman. There are various spellings of her name as well, so you might see it printed in different ways. But Asnat or Asenat Barazani, I just thought this was a really interesting example. She was a highly educated Torah scholar living through the end of the 16th, early 17th century Kurdistan. So that would be sort of, I think, more or less Iraq, although the borders are a little hazy and geography is not my strong suit. She's given this title of Tanait, not specifically rabbi, but interestingly enough, a lot of the early rabbis themselves, the sages, they describe themselves as Tanaitim. And so there is clearly this rabbinic link, although she's not named explicitly as a rabbi. She is the daughter of a rabbi who started this yeshiva in Mosul. And he had no sons, so he trained his daughter to study Torah. And interestingly, we have this written record that she says that her father made her partner swear never to allow me to engage in work, like in household labor. And thus he did as he was commanded, so the husband followed suit. From the start, the rabbi, being her husband, Jacob Mizrahi, was involved in his studies and did not have time to teach the students. So I would teach them in his stead, a helpmate. And then we also have this quote that I never left the entrance to my house or went outside. So this is about her childhood. I was like a princess of Israel. I grew up in the laps of scholars, anchored to my father, of blessed memory. I was never taught any work, but sacred study to uphold, as it is said, and you should recite it day and night. And there she's quoting the book of Joshua. And so interestingly, there's kind of this, I was not super familiar with her, but there is this sort of folklore around her as this not quite rabbi, but rabbinic, proto-rabbinic figure, you know, in the 16th, 17th century. And she is still, I think, there is still a tradition of people who trace their lineage back to her family. And there is still a lot of pride for this particular woman. But interestingly enough, you know, she's Mizrahi, and we don't get a lot. I think actually there were records that were found when I was seeing something. It was like there were archives that were in Berlin, and when the Berlin Wall came down or something, they were more readily available, and more people found out about her. But just as we're going to kind of look at the question of female ordination and women's leadership in the 20th century, the 21st century, just a kind of reminder that even though from the perspective of kind of religious organizations and, you know, mainstream religious denominations, women have been present and been leaders in Jewish communities at various times, regardless of the limitations that are traditional, that have traditionally been placed on them. So I wanted to migrate us more into the present. We've made it now to the 19th century. And that is where we see the rise of Reform Judaism originating in Germany, and it's later brought to the United States by German-trained rabbis. And I believe Shir Tikva is a Reform congregation, so I don't think I need to do a ton of explanations here. But there's this attempt in Reform Judaism to harmonize Jewish tradition with more modern sensibilities, with a modern lifestyle, less emphasis on halacha and law, and more so on other aspects of Jewish culture, with an emphasis on individual autonomy, on making one's own choices, and on religious pluralism. And so some of the major accomplishments of Reform Judaism were the abolition of separate women's galleries within synagogues and the institution of family pews. So that started around the 1850s. And I mean, when I found it interesting, I was reading a text with these kind of major accomplishments, and we had this in the 1850s, and then the ordination of the first female rabbi in America in 1972. So there's a bit of a gap there. And I think it's safe to say things were not necessarily all hunky-dory and automatically inclusive. But I
And
think
in
that,
Mississippi,
yeah, I thought that, so Paula Ackerman there that I have pictured, she's not the first female rabbi from 1972. She actually predates that. She's, and she was the first female spiritual leader after her husband died, and her congregation basically, she was already leading study sessions. She was already facilitating a bunch of prayers, and her congregation basically begged her to take over. And so I think it was 1950 to 1953, she served as the first female spiritual leader at this congregation before they ultimately found a full-time male rabbi. But it's interesting that that's 20 years before anyone is actually officially ordinated. You already have this instance all the way out in Mississippi of a woman who was leading services and, you know, doing that spiritual leadership. Ellis, you got a question?
Yeah, so it doesn't seem like Reform Judaism from the start was that focused on kind of women having equal status. It was something that, if it wasn't until 1972, so it took a long time, even within Reform Judaism, for
Yes.
that to
Well,
happen.
part of it that I found really interesting when I was doing some of the reading to get some of the loose dates, is that we have the rise of these kind of female equivalent rights within Reform Judaism. So things like the Brit or Simchat Bat, like the baby naming ceremony, which serves as kind of the equivalent to a male circumcision ceremony. That was really spearheaded by the Reform movement. And it's actually the conservative movement that is faster to adopt bat mitzvahs, because there was this sort of feeling within, I think it was the American Reform movement, that like, oh, we've already got this female right, like we don't really need the bat mitzvah yet. And so you've kind of, again, there's always this push and pull of like, well, we're going forward in this way, but there is a long-standing kind of institutional memory of how things ought to operate and how things should operate, and change is a slow process. I just found it was interesting too that the first bat mitzvah ceremony that we know of actually was performed by Mordechai Kaplan, who you might know is the founder of Reconstructionist Judaism, and he did that for his daughter Judith all the way back in 1922. But it wasn't until kind of the 50s and 60s that bat mitzvahs, I think those were the earliest kind of rising numbers of bat mitzvahs, and through the 70s into 90s is when they really become more mainstream. But all of these things take time, and there seems to have been some tension in the Reform movement with the goals of what a Reform movement ought to be, and also the people running that sort of institution. And There's also a really fascinating history of kind of women's groups at synagogues and the ways in which women, on the one hand, raised a lot of money, did a lot of the social services for their congregations, but were kind of sidelined to those supporting roles and were not actually given the responsibilities and the designations of spiritual leadership. It would have been more just like, well, the women's council and the sisters of the synagogue who do these things. And I think, we still see similar things in a lot of the kind of women's organizations at various synagogues. But it was interesting to see how far back that history went. So if we had had more time, I would have brought that in, but just to kind of fill in a bit more of the gap, that spiritual leadership is one thing, and there are also all of these other ways that women are getting involved and are sort of permitted to help, but perhaps not always at the same level of respect or authority as men. So yeah, were there any questions on any of this so far?
I just had a quick question. The tahinas that we talked about in the 16th century started. Was there anything equivalent to that in the beginning of modern Reform Judaism?
I don't know that, I don't know that there was as rich of a tradition that persisted. This seems to have been kind of a piece of history that wasn't, and part of this I think is just the nature of the kind of documents that we had. Like a lot of them were pamphlets. They weren't like volumes that would have been preserved in the same way. And I think also probably a lot of records and a lot of these things like are coming from Ashkenazi culture, which, over the course of the 20th century, we see drastic shifts in where Jews are. And so I think there's a lot that seems to have been lost. I don't have a clear answer for you on kind of the link of continuity, but I didn't see as much there as I did in terms of the tachinas in this earlier history. And I think oftentimes there is kind of this enforced rigidity that ensues following kind of the formalization of a particular denomination or a particular kind of sect. And so even though Reform Judaism was started as a means for X, I think there's also seems to have been a kind of calcification of the leadership and the perspectives that would have been at the table. So there is, again, this kind of push and pull. But that's a really good question, and I would love to explore that a little bit more at some point, of just kind of how much of those traditions would have been accessible. And I think right now I'm also focusing more so on the kind of American reform movement. And so we know that it started in Germany, but a lot of the kind of history we have accessible is America centric. And so, there's also some differences there. I thought this was also really interesting, bringing us a bit more into modernity, this question of Orthodox women in prayer. And there is this women's tefillah movement that grows out of Orthodox Jewish women's need for meaningful and more participatory roles in prayer services that still remain within the confines of halakha. And so there is this kind of attempt to maximize the level of participation for women that is possible, while also not breaking any boundaries that might be too radical for orthodoxy. And so interestingly enough, even in these kind of prayer groups, there is not an attempt to cast these groups as an actual quorum, as an actual minyan. That is still the domain of men in the Orthodox tradition. But I thought also it was, I found this story of the first tefillah group in the late 1960s in Manhattan, and it was at a Simchat Torah celebration. And Simchat Torah is a holiday with, you know, such an emphasis on synagogue, on formal prayer, and specifically on just like Torah worship, the joy of Torah reading and liturgy. And these are all things where women traditionally have not been permitted to participate. And so there's the synagogue at Lincoln, sorry, the women who are the women congregants at Lincoln Square Synagogue in Manhattan were actually given Torah scrolls for this particular celebration and permitted to convene their own sort of separate Torah reading. And that kind of led to the development of more focused women's Orthodox groups for reading Torah, for studying Torah. And by the late 1970s, many prayer groups were beginning to meet regularly for Rosh Chodesh in the US, with some caveats. And so Dvarim Biktusha, so the matters of holiness, certain types of prayers would be omitted because the women taking part in these groups would not have been permitted to actually read some of those prayers that were reserved for men. So the Kedusha prayer is one of them, and the repetition of the Amidah, also the mourner's Kaddish. So that would have not been on the table, but you can see this kind of tension between a tradition that severely limits women's experience, and also, you know, communities where women really want to be able to participate, to have a seat at the table, or I guess maybe not a seat, maybe they're standing in Amidah, but yeah. So Shoshana, I see you have a question.
Yeah, thanks. I guess I'm curious why Mortar's Kaddish is counted as one of those things you need a man for when women are perfectly capable of mourning on their own. If you have an answer.
I mean, I agree with you, so I don't have a real answer. I think it just has to do with the numbers for minyan, and that's a prayer that requires the quorum. And so women praying on their own would not constitute that quorum within an Orthodox perspective. So that would be my assumption.
Do you know of any alternative rituals that women were developing in the community for mourning?
That's a really interesting question. I don't know that specifically, but that would be a really interesting thing to explore, because I mean, you're right. Like, I think that is such a, when we talked about the Techinas, we talked about sort of life cycle. We talked about the needs of women spiritually and in community, and grieving is such a major part of the Jewish experience, that I don't know that, you know, I'm not sure what that would look like in the tefillah groups. And I think that really kind of reflects the struggle of trying to create a space for women's prayers within a tradition that historically and logistically has excluded women from those areas. And so I don't know if it's that I don't know, or that, you know, there isn't really a good answer altogether. And I imagine it's somewhere in the middle there. But that's a really, you know, I think there is likely a certain level of acceptance that women within this kind of a community would be bringing to this group. And already this is like, you know, more inclusion and more opportunities than might have otherwise been afforded them. But I don't have an answer for that, unfortunately. So with that in mind, I wanted to turn our attention to, now that we've gone to the 16th century, we've gone through to the rise of modernity, I wanted to end with a discussion about more modern issues facing Jewish communities today. And so I think we see with, gender egalitarian services, with the inclusion of women in traditionally male rituals like a Brit Milah with the baby naming. We see this kind of widening of halacha to better accommodate women's ritual experiences. It's very far from perfect, but there is more of an allowance for it. And so on the other hand, however, there is still really no clear kind of halachic roadmap for the inclusion of trans and non-binary Jews who operate outside of a gendered binary. Scholar Helena Darwin has this expression, the cisgendering of kind of a religious reality, which is a phenomenon I think we see very clearly in Judaism, where specific roles, tasks, parts of life cycle traditions are very much dictated by one's gender and one's gendered life. And so the centering of Torah and its gendered adherence is also very firmly rooted to the notion of being fruitful and multiplying, which historically has happened in a very particular kind of way, with a man, with a woman. I don't need to tell the rest. And so there is this positioning of cisgender experience as the default model for religious participation. I just want to make sure everyone is familiar with the language and the words cisgender. Does anybody want to throw out a definition or ask a question? Shoshana?
Yeah, I can offer a definition. Cisgender is the idea that your gender matches the genitals you were born with, and that they match, and there's no question of that in yourself.
Yeah, exactly. So the sex you were born with is in alignment with how you experience your own gender identity, essentially. And so this positioning of cisgender experience, man versus woman, is really, like we talked last week about these kind of androgynous, was it last week or 2 weeks ago? We talked about kind of the recognition of other kinds of gendered experiences, but usually in the framework of an exception to the rule. And a lot of the kind of halachic questions that the rabbis were bringing to the table were, okay, an acknowledgement that other gender realities and identities may exist, but trying to place them within a framework that is very binary. And so this poses a bit of a problem for folks who do not adhere to a gender binary. And I wanted to take a look at the kind of rearticulation and reimagining of the mikvah rite as what I think is a pretty promising avenue for a kind of queering of Jewish ritual. Arif, you had a question?
Unmute. I wanted to know whether there was a way I could copy out this page or most of it for a trans person, one of my grandchildren.
Oh, yeah, I can send you the document, and I have other stuff as well. So let me know, or someone can get in touch with me, and I can email this later. I know the video will be shared, but definitely. So
how do you want to get my
we can figure that out after. If you maybe give your contact info to Ellis, and he can connect, he can send an email or something.
Or do you want to just put it in the chat, your email?
Sure.
Okay.
Gladly.
All right. So we're going to look at this idea of the mikvah as kind of a social location and also a potential halachic model for understanding transition, transformation, and affirmation of the kind of gendered religious body. And I have this graphic here from Keshet, which is a Jewish LGBT group, with the message trans Jews belong here. So let's take a look now. There's a really great example by Max Strassfeld, who himself is a trans scholar of Judaism, and the author of the book Trans Talmud, Androgynes and Eunuchs in Rabbinic Literature. And so this kind of fits in with a broader conversation of mikvahs. And I know that we're all coming from the Massachusetts area, so I'm guessing many of us are familiar with Mayim Chaim, the non-Orthodox mikvah center in the Boston area. And that was kind of the first of its kind as a resource for women to experience, the practices and the rituals of Niddah without needing to necessarily adhere to the all of the halachic requirements for participation that would bar some people. And there's been this kind of ongoing discussion as to whether the, okay, Shoshana, I'm gonna ask you some questions perhaps, because I'd love to hear more about that. And we're gonna kind of get to what I'm presenting here is actually just a kind of sample liturgy that Max Strassfeld himself actually helped put together. But I thought it was also important to kind of locate that within the context of what Mayim Chaim is focused on, which is kind of expanding the ritual opportunities and experiences for people who may not have traditionally felt welcomed. And there is this kind of ongoing debate over things like mikvahs and like Niddah practices, where we ask, are these based on sort of, is this a space for women to engage in their own specific ritual? Or is this idea of women needing to go clean, is that, rooted in misogynistic assumptions? And I think, the answer can be a little more complex and nuanced than that. But places like Mayim Chaim have been really sort of instrumental in shedding a light on these traditional practices that don't necessarily need to be interpreted the same way that they have been in the past historically, but kind of bridging that gap between our past and our present and our future as Jews, and connecting us with the traditions that come before us, and finding new ways to connect to those rituals. And so mikvah for trans folks who may be transitioning provides a really interesting kind of case study. And so this is from Strassfeld. The mikvah pool recalls the watery state that each of us knew before we were born. And if you remember our first lecture on Genesis, we talked a lot about that kind of watery state of chaos and shmeos, in contrast to the dry land that the second narrative talked about in that created state. And so the ritual of entering and leaving Mayim Chaim, living waters, creates the time and space to acknowledge and embrace a new space of life. Shoshana, did you want to talk a little bit before we kind of look at the ritual, or did you want to wait? I'm curious to hear about the experience of your friend.
I'm looking over your slide here. Maybe
Yeah.
let's go through this slide
Sure.
and then I'll talk about their experience.
Yeah, for sure. So this is actually part of like a trio. So this particular ritual that Strassfeld came up with has 3 components. So it's framed in the past, the present, and the future. And so there is this kind of recognition of where we have come from that is marked by the recitation of the Shehecheyanu. And so the actual Hebrew there is, blessed is the one who revives us, sustains us, and enables us to reach this moment. And so each of these recitations of prayers of kind of a particular liturgical component, and then also an intention that is given with it. And so there is this intention for this first immersion of our tradition becoming a house for us. May our bodies be our home within it. So kind of rooting one's Jewish identity and one's kind of lived experience within the body itself. So a very embodied sense of identity that is linked with one's, Jewish experience, Jewish spirituality, and kind of emphasizing the role that the body is playing in that process of identification, which would be really central as well to a person who is transgender, whose body has maybe not provided the home in the clearest way that really feels like their home. So Berachot 54a, this rabbinic text, the one who calls out about the past, that is a wasted prayer, which is to say the prayer may be wasted, but the act of calling out is never a waste. When we cry out, we build a new past, the past that should have been, and out of our new past, we shape our future. And so there is this really kind of cyclical aspect of which is also kind of inherent in the ritual of the mikvah. If you're familiar with any kind of rite of passage, there is usually a kind of, it's typically marked as well in these three kinds of stages of a separation and an isolation period, and then kind of reacclimation into the community. And so this kind of removal from one's past, not in a shameful way, but in kind of coming out of that to be able to build something new. There's also this, do we only say blessings for collective miracles, but not for individual miracles? We answer, like the waters of the mikveh, miracles cannot be so easily separated. And here there's an acknowledgement, we keenly feel the loss of all individual gendered voices that have been silenced. Each member of our community who can recite with a full heart the Shehecheyanu performs a collective miracle. So that's the first of three immersions. The second one is really focused, as I said, on the present. And there's this really beautiful poem that is excerpted here. Ruben Zellman, we are all twilight people. We can never be fully labeled or defined. We are crisscross paths of memories and destinations, streaks of light swirled together. We are neither day nor night. We are both neither and all. And so there is this kind of calling back to the initial state of creation, to those murky waters of creation, the kind of unformed nature out of which, Judaism says we all emerge, and this kind of coming back to the water as a means of reformulating oneself, coming into one's presence, being both neither and all. So this process of liminality and of kind of being not quite in either position is really central to this second immersion here. May this in-between light illuminate our way to God who transcends all categories and definitions. Blessed are you, God of all, who brings on the twilight. So what I think is really interesting here is how we kind of get we get a kind of affirmation of the trans experience in this kind of lack of identity and this, both neither and all, sorry. And we see this rooted in our actual prayer formulae, in the tradition of Jewish learning and the cosmological understanding of the world from creation. And so there is this real, in a time where often, religion is sort of held in a separate place from queer and trans identity, the ability to be able to locate one's trans experience and one's journey of transition within a Jewish framework, I think is very significant in terms of affirming not just that one is a trans person, but that one can be a trans Jew. And so I find that to be very powerful. The third immersion is focused on the future. And in the vast, limitless nothing of her allness, with no borders or boundaries, no direction, and no distinctions in her infinite, eternal self, that her was intentional, God said, "Let there be me." And God stirred and stretched and shrank and strived and sighed and surged until she became who he is. And his isness is who he always was and always will be in the midst of her sacred unfoldings. And God called himself whole and saw everything that was possible from his radiant wholeness. And there was someone, and there was someone, and from that someone, God was finally ready to create a somewhere. And we have the blessing. Blessed are you, eternal our God, ruler of the universe, who renews the work of creation every day. And so this emphasis on kind of the cycle of creation, of destruction and recreation out of that, the kind of, I don't think we had a chance to really talk about this, but interestingly enough, from the kind of cosmological perspective of some of the Genesis texts, the flood narrative of Noah is framed really as like a literal undoing of the ordered separation of the waters of Genesis 1. And so through this kind of this language of creation and recreation and this process, we see this kind of these allusions to our Jewish points of belief and ideas about God's creation, and we are able to locate this ritual within that context. So I just have a couple of last sort of thoughts, but I'd love to hear from Shoshana now. I'm curious, did you say you were present at that, or just heard about it from them?
I was one of the witnesses or
Okay, wow.
attendants, or I forget what name you call for the people who were there during the mikveh immersion. My friend was raised in an Orthodox family, and when he realized that he was trans, he went through both a crisis of faith because Judaism didn't acknowledge that, and also a crisis of like his identity, because he felt like he had to transform his whole self in order to be who he was. And so for him, the mikveh was a way of both reclaiming his identity as a man and reaffirming his connection to Judaism. And by doing so in a Jewish space, even if it wasn't an Orthodox space, it gave him that connection. And now he is very happy. Has a partner. He is still Orthodox. He's figured out a way to make it work. And it was a beautiful ceremony, when he did it. And it was so meaningful on so many different levels. It's beautiful.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing. I think, what I'm kind of presenting is kind of the nuts and bolts of some of this process. But all of that is kind of meaningless without the emotional aspects. And like, there's a reason to create this kind of ritual, and it's to fill a certain need. And so that is just really affirming to hear about. So I really appreciate that you shared that. And I just really wanted to end off with this idea of mikveh as a site for queer disidentification. And so disidentification is a term from queer theory about kind of locating the means for one's own freedom or liberation through the kind of a refashioning almost of the master's tools, so to speak. And so there's this quote by scholar S.J. Krasno: "In the case of innovative mikveh ritual, the meaning of the ritual is reconfigured, revealing its normative or oppressive elements, and recircuiting mikveh so that empowers trans identity." And hopefully that sounds like that was also the experience for your friend Shoshana. And I think finding these spaces where we can create openings for diversity of experience, of perspective within our community, and through a Jewish framework is really key to fostering the next generations of Jewish leaders and our community. It's how we keep people connected, and I think it's really important that we affirm everyone's identity, and anyone can be Jewish in whatever way is meaningful for them. And so I'm really fascinated. I've done some research myself on this kind of reclaiming of the mikvah ritual as in terms of queer disidentification. So that's, I see there's a question from Nan, but that's really the end of my sort of formal presentation.
My question was that it seemed from what I was reading, if I interpreted it correctly, that this ritual that you use as an example seemed to be for a trans man.
Yes.
And wondering if the ritual is substantially different for a trans woman.
Yeah, so that's a great question. And this is particularly also, this particular ritual was for like a post-surgery thing. And so not all trans people who are transitioning necessarily have the capacity or the desire to go through surgery for their gender affirmation. And so this is just really one example that I thought kind of illuminated things clearly, but there are other examples. This is still a fairly nascent kind of phenomenon, so the literature is fairly limited, but I think even Strassfeld had some different iterations of these ritual processes, and part of the beauty here, I think, also is having the templates to kind of be able to modify. So these are not inaccessible modes of ritual and prayer, and elements could very easily be customized. But this was just the example I was highlighting. But I meant to bring that up in terms of, no two trans experiences are necessarily the same. And even in terms of many folks who identify as trans may actually not really be interested in a formal transition kind of thing. So,
my second question was going to be about this, is whether people who are gender fluid or non-binary have used the mikvah in any way to claim that identity in a public manner or in
Yes. Yes, I know of some people who have.
Mm-hmm. And the other question I had for you, Shoshana, was your friend who went through the mikvah and has found a way to remain Orthodox. Does their Orthodox community accept them as male? I think it was a trans man you were talking about.
Yeah, he no longer lives in the United States, and he is stealth. So basically he is male and no one knows otherwise.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, interestingly
the,
enough,
the mikvah rituals, as from what I've learned and seen and heard about, is so uniquely personal that there are these templates, but each person has their own heart how they want to do it.
Right.
Totally. I was just going to add to that I've seen some interesting kind of literature on this idea that within Orthodox kind of communities and like rabbinical courts and stuff, there is actually somewhat more of an understanding of trans identity, because you can still conform a trans man into like a cisgendered heterosexual marriage. And so there are still these ways in which actually, you know, if halakhically you can grant that someone can change genders, they then fit into a binary system in a different way, depending on, and that would again be dependent, but on a bunch of different factors. But it's interesting that, you know, the specific questions and issues that arise can be interpreted by different religious authorities in a variety of different ways. And, you know, I think that there is, you know, lots to look forward to, hopefully, in terms of more open-mindedness and more acceptance of meeting people where they're at and including them within, and really creating a space for them within our religious communities. So, Karen, you also had your hand up.
Yeah, so I have heard, I don't know of anyone who hesitates to label a baby, even though sexually they have the physical apparatus of one sex, because they feel that their gender is not as well defined these days, with people changing their identification as they grow. So how does Judaism view that? And how do those people and their children fit into this schema?
Interesting. I don't know that Judaism on the whole has an answer for that. I kind of, to echo what Shoshana was saying, I think a lot of this would be kind of on a case-to-case basis. I'm also aware that some of our kind of standard ritual conventions, like the Brit Milah, the male circumcision, there are some Jews who do not wish to circumcise their male children, for example. And so my understanding is that in those cases, if they would want to do a kind of ceremony, they might actually do kind of more of a version of the girl's baby naming. So I think, you know, depending on what sect or what kind of tradition you're coming from, there is kind of this beauty within the Jewish tradition that we saw reflected even in our rabbinic texts, of like all of these different perspectives that are kind of all next to each other. And so I think that, you know, that is going to be potentially something to kind of keep an eye on. I don't have a solid response for what we are doing at this moment. I think it would be more so up to particular families or parents to decide in what ways they would like to have their children partake in those particular rituals. Does that help at all? Oh, you're muted.
Yes, a little bit.
I don't think we're there yet, is the
Sort
thing.
of, yes,
So
I
Well, that-
think so.
Most families that I know who do something like that, they often, because of society, raise their child with a pronoun, a male or female pronoun, as well as the understanding that, you know, this is just what we've, you know, selected for now. You can change it if it's not working for you. And, you know, kind of give the child an understanding as they grow up that there's a difference between, you know, legally what's on your birth certificate and who you are as a person, and that, you know, you have the opportunity at any point in your life to decide if it's right or not. And so there's often a lot more communication about what gender means versus sex versus, you know, society's expectations.
Yeah. And I think something to kind of go along with that is when we actually provide equal opportunities to all children and they're not excluded or left behind from learning these kinds of things, then they also have the ability to make some of those decisions for themselves. So definitely. Nan, I see that you had your hand up as well.
Well, if this conversation is over, I wanted to go back to something else, but I'm happy to continue with this conversation.
I'd say you are probably good to ask your question.
Okay, what I was wondering is, I was thinking about how so many Jewish women had been in the 60s, 70s, 80s, probably later, but were involved in the creation of alternative religious traditions of women's ritual groups, some in pagan, but a lot of very specifically women's ritual groups, thinking of people like Starhawk, Judith Plaskow, and I was wondering if there was this ongoing sense of a separate women's liturgy in people's minds. I mean, I remember when I was raised Christian, when I first encountered the idea of what Judaism was for women, which was when I was in divinity school, and I was in a Jewish Christian feminist dialogue group, and that the Jewish women talked about feeling there had been a history of women's ritual in the home, and that this was something that they drew upon to some extent to creating these new kind of rituals. And I'm just wondering if you've seen any kind of anyone who's traced that trajectory of Jewish women's involvement in Judaism, looking at what's also happened in this women's ritual creation.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if I'm understanding your question, because I think there were a couple different pieces there. So one component is about women's creation of ritual forms of Judaism. And so I wanted to, if I had a bit more time, I might have looked at, I'm interested in just people I know actually in the Kohenet Hebrew Priestess Institute, and these ideas of women's religious participation and experience as being central. But I mean, I think there's a lot of different kinds of traditions that have arisen and been developed, but I'm not sure what exactly where the question was. I think I'm getting a little lost.
My question was actually both. Okay. So I was commingling them, but it was more initially, it was a comment that it was this when we were talking about the women's prayer in the 16th century, that my first thought was, oh, no wonder people like Starhawk had felt that they had the authority to do that. And then that got mixed up with the development of women's rituals through Judaism, but I was not clear.
No, that's okay. I will say, if the text I was drawing, some of the stuff on the Techinas is this great book, Voices of the Patriarch. I'm sorry, of the Matriarchs. Wow, I just erased Lynn's experience.
Okay, Voices of
the Matriarchs. Sorry, it's blurry because I have my photo. It's by Chava Weisler. I can put that in the chat. So there's a lot of really cool places to explore. Ultimately, I just kind of wanted to give us all a bit of a highlights reel. But there's so much. You could probably do a whole semester on just Techinas and the genre of women's prayer in a particular time period. So,
thank you.
No problem. I'm just putting that in the chat.
Simon, I think we've reached the
yes.
end. I really appreciate your taking us through this course and developing this course for us on behalf of the temple. I just want to say thank you for bringing this material to us.
Thank you for your participation, everybody, and for showing up.
Thank
It's
you
been
so much.
Thank you
very
so much.
interesting.
All right.
You.
Have a good night, everybody.
All right. Thanks a lot, Simon.
Night.
too.
Take
Bye.
care.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.